Caleb Hart is standing in his corral at dawn, holding an empty rice bowl. The wood is still warm from last night. Behind him, his ranch house sits quiet, one window flickering with the last of a fire he built for a stranger. Then he looks up. The ridge above his property is lined with riders. 300 of them, mounted and still, armor catching the first light like scattered embers across the hillside. They don't move. They don't make a sound. They just watch him from up there, the way a storm watches before it drops. One bowl of rice. That's what he gave her. That's all he did. So what exactly did this man walk into? The Arizona Territory in the winter of 1878 was not a place that forgave weakness. The land around Redwood Flats was cracked open by 3 years of drought, the kind of dry that turned creek beds into pale scars and split fence posts down the grain. What little grass remained grew in brittle patches that crunched under boot like broken glass. Caleb Hart owned 40 acres of that cracked earth, a small herd that had shrunk to 3 cows, and a ranch house with a roof that leaked in 2 places whenever it rained hard enough to matter. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders from actual work, and quietly running out of time. The land deed had a payment due in 6 weeks, and he didn't have it. He wasn't broke in a dramatic way, no gambling debts, no bad deals, just the slow grind of a small operation in a dry year, where every month cost slightly more than the last one paid. His neighbors knew it. He knew it. Nobody said anything about it, which was its own kind of weight. The bag of rice sitting on his kitchen shelf was bought with the coins from selling his father's pocket watch. A Hamilton, silver case, kept perfect time. He'd carried it for 11 years after his father died, and then sold it to a hardware merchant in Redwood Flats for $4.30. The rice cost $2 even. He'd used the rest for lamp oil and nails. He didn't buy the rice because he was hungry for it specifically. He bought it because it was cheap, it kept, and it filled a man up. That's what he told himself. The truth was also that he'd been hungry before, genuinely hungry, the kind that doesn't let you sleep. He was 9 years old during the worst of it, 1863, when his mother kept a single pot of water on the fire and called it soup. He never forgot what that felt like, and he never stopped responding to it in other people. That was Caleb's code, though he wouldn't have called it that. He wouldn't have called it anything. It was just what you did. You didn't let a person go without if you had something to share. He'd grown up in a part of the country where that was simply understood, and he'd carried it west with him when he came to Arizona. Redwood Flats itself didn't share that understanding, not entirely. It was a frontier town of about 400 people, the kind that had been built fast and was aging badly. The buildings along the main street were already warping in the heat, their false fronts cracking at the joints. The people who lived there were mostly decent but cautious, and the kind of caution common to isolated places tends to calcify into suspicion over time. 2 miles east of town, a camp of Chinese railroad workers had settled, while a new stretch of track was being laid across the valley. Redwood Flats tolerated them the way a man tolerates a dog he didn't ask for. Careful, watchful, ready to be offended. There had been no real trouble, but the tension sat in the air at the general store and in the pews on Sunday, unspoken but obvious. Caleb didn't share that tension. He'd worked alongside Chinese men on a fencing job 2 years back and found them no different from anyone else. Some good, some not. Most just trying to get through the day. He wasn't trying to be enlightened about it. It just seemed obvious to him. None of that mattered yet, though. What mattered that evening was the sky. He'd been watching it since mid-afternoon, a dark line building along the northern horizon, moving fast and low. By the time he got the horses into the barn and started boarding the east-facing window, the temperature had already dropped 10 degrees. He got the boards up. He got the fire going. He sat down with a cup of coffee and listened to the wind start to pick up outside. Then he heard something that wasn't the wind. It wasn't a knock. It was more like a weight landing against the fence post. A dull impact he felt more than heard, underneath the sound of the wind climbing into something serious. He almost ignored it. Could have been a branch, a piece of loose board caught in the gust. But he'd been a rancher long enough to know the difference between what the wind moves and what it doesn't. He pulled his coat off the hook and opened the door. The rain hit him sideways, cold enough to hurt, the kind that comes with a temperature drop and doesn't apologize for it. He had to shield his eyes to see past the corral, and when he did, he saw a shape at the fence line, small, crumpled, not moving. He crossed the yard at a run. She was on her side in the mud, one arm hooked through the lowest fence rail, like she'd been trying to hold herself up and just run out of the ability to do it. Her clothes were soaked through, dark traveling clothes that weren't made for this weather, layered fabric, wrapped and tied in a way he didn't recognize. And strapped to her back, wedged between her shoulder blades and her spine, was a wooden trunk about the size of a large Bible, lacquered black, strapped down with a double length of cord wound tight as rigging. He didn't stop to think about who she was or where she came from. He put his arms under her and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, but the trunk made it awkward. She stirred when he picked her up. Not awake, but not fully gone either. Somewhere in between, her eyes half open and unfocused. He carried her across the yard and got her through the door and set her down near the fire as gently as he could manage, which wasn't very gently because his boots were slipping on the wet floor. He laid her on her side to keep the trunk from pressing against her spine. She wouldn't let go of it. Even then, barely conscious, one hand had found one of the cords, and her fingers had closed around it. He didn't try to remove it. He left it. He got a blanket over her, got more wood on the fire, and then crouched there and looked at her properly for the first time. She was young, maybe 20, Japanese. He'd seen a handful of Japanese men in Tucson and recognized the features. Her face was pale from cold, not from any natural pallor, and there was a cut along her jaw that had dried before the rain washed it away. Whatever had happened to her before she reached his fence line, it hadn't been easy. He cooked the rice. There wasn't much of the bag left. He'd already used half of it across the past week. So he stretched it with a little water and put it on the fire and waited. She was more conscious by the time it was ready, sitting up slowly with one hand still wrapped around the cord of that trunk, watching the fire and then watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Not afraid, not grateful, just watching. The way someone watches when they're trying to figure out what kind of situation they've ended up in. He handed her the bowl. She took it with both hands, a small, precise motion, and bowed her head slightly before she brought it to her lips. She ate every grain without speaking. He sat across from her with his coffee and listened to the storm drive itself against the walls, rattling the boards he'd nailed up, pressing at the seams of the roof, looking for a way in. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. He didn't ask where she'd come from, or where she was going, or what was in the trunk she still hadn't let go of, even with a warm bowl in her other hand. Some questions wait for daylight. Some waits feel like the decent thing. She fell asleep sitting up, her back against the wall, the trunk pressed between her side and her arm. He stayed awake and kept the fire going. By morning, the storm had broken. He stepped outside into the cold gray light, exhaled a cloud of breath, and looked up at the ridge. They were already there. 300 riders. That was his first count, done fast and instinctive the way a man counts trouble before his mind catches up to what his eyes are telling him. They stretched across the full length of the ridge in a line so even it looked deliberate, because it was. Horses standing still at that distance, armor catching the low morning sun in dull orange and gray flashes. Not a banner, not a flag, just the line of them up there, watching him stand in the mud of his own yard. His rifle was inside. He didn't go get it, not yet. He stood and looked up at them and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with the temperature, The kind that settles in your chest when you understand that whatever is happening is much larger than anything you have a ready answer for. One rider separated from the line and came down alone. He moved at a walk, no urgency, the horse picking its way down the slope with the patience of an animal that has done this before. The man on its back wore armor across the chest and shoulders, dark, lacquered plates over trail clothes, a sword at his hip. He was perhaps 40, maybe older, with a face that gave nothing away and a posture so controlled it looked carved. He stopped at the fence, not close enough to reach, exactly far enough to make the distance a statement. Behind him, a second rider came down at a trot, younger, lighter, and stopped just off the first man's shoulder. He had no armor. He had a notebook tucked under one arm. The first man spoke, short, measured sentences. His eyes stayed on Caleb the entire time. The younger man translated. Commander Kenji asks whether you understand the gravity of what you have done. A pause. He says the woman you are hiding is not yours to hide. He says she belongs to the house of Lord Matsuda, and that you will return her before the sun moves another hand's width. He says if you do not, this ranch will not be here by nightfall. The translator's name, Caleb would learn later, was Taro. He was maybe 22, spoke careful English with a slight Dutch lilt in the vowels, and had the particular stillness of someone who has learned that the wrong word at the wrong moment costs more than silence. Caleb looked at him, then at Kenji, then back at Taro. I didn't know who she was when I brought her in, he said. She was down at my fence in a storm, nearly dead from cold. He kept his voice flat, not defensive. I fed her and let her sleep by the fire. That's the whole story. Taro translated. Kenji listened without moving. Then Kenji spoke again, 4 words, and Taro said, He does not believe you. Caleb nodded slowly. He understood that. He wouldn't have believed it either, standing on that side of the fence. He ran the numbers without meaning to. 300 men up on that ridge, plus Kenji and Taro at his fence. 1 rifle inside, 1 handgun on the hook by the door, maybe 30 rounds between them. 3 cows in the back pasture who would not be any help at all. The land deed with 6 weeks left on it, which meant the ranch wasn't fully his yet anyway. The math was not complicated. He did the only thing that made sense. I'm not hiding anybody, he said. Come inside and see for yourself. Kenji's eyes moved for the first time since he'd stopped at the fence. A small shift, assessing. He studied Caleb's face the way you study ground before you put weight on it. Then he said something short and sharp, and Taro said, He will come, but his men will remain where they are, and if anything happens to him inside, they will not wait for an order. Nothing's going to happen to him, Caleb said. He turned and walked back toward the house, boots pulling at the soft mud, and didn't look back to check if they were following. Looking back would have cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. The door swung open. Kenji stepped inside. Izumi was sitting at the table, eating the last of the cornbread. Kenji stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't look at Caleb. He didn't look at the room, the fire, the low ceiling, or the rifle hanging on the wall. His eyes went straight to Izumi, and something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not the way a man looks when he finds what he's been searching for and feels relief flood through him. It was the opposite of relief. It was a jaw tightening, a breath held just a beat too long. The look of a man who has found exactly what he expected and is furious at himself for hoping otherwise. Izumi kept eating the cornbread. She didn't look up, not once. She broke off a small piece, chewed it slowly, set the rest down on the plate with a deliberateness that, even to Caleb, who understood nothing of what was happening, felt like a very specific kind of statement. Taro stepped in behind Kenji and stopped near the door. His eyes moved between the two of them with the expression of someone watching a fire he has no authority to put out. Caleb pulled out the second chair at the table and sat down, mostly to make clear he wasn't going anywhere and this was still his house. "Tell me who she is," he said to Taro. Taro glanced at Kenji. Kenji gave a single, short nod, so Taro told him. Her name was Izumi Matsuda. Her father, Lord Matsuda, ran one of the largest remaining daimyo houses on the western coast of Japan. Old money, old land, old influence. The kind that had survived the country's recent upheaval by being careful and ruthless in equal measure. The clan was in the middle of a succession dispute. Her older brother had been the intended heir. He was dead now, and the circumstances of his death had never been formally settled, because the man most likely responsible for it was also the man her father had chosen as Izumi's husband. That was the arrangement, a political marriage designed to consolidate two rival branches of the clan under one roof and close the succession question. Clean on paper. The groom got legitimacy, Lord Matsuda got peace. The fact that this same man almost certainly had the heir killed to create the opening for exactly this outcome was, apparently, the kind of detail a father could look past when the alternative was clan war. Izumi could not look past it. She'd run 3 weeks ago, taking with her the only thing that mattered, the trunk. Caleb looked at it sitting on the floor beside her chair, that black lacquered box she'd carried through a desert storm with a cord wrapped around her wrist like a lifeline. He asked Taro what was in it. Taro hesitated, then translated the question to Izumi directly. She answered without looking up from the plate, 4 short sentences. Taro said, "The clan seal of House Matsuda, a land charter, a tanto that belonged to her grandfather, who carried it at the Battle of Sekigahara, and a document." "What kind of document?" Taro looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Caleb. "Her brother wrote it before he died. A full account. Names, dates, instructions given and received. It implicates the man her father chose for the marriage in every detail of what happened to him." Caleb sat with that for a second. So the marriage wasn't just something Izumi refused on principle. She was carrying proof of a murder through the Arizona desert, being chased by 300 men sent by a father who either didn't know what his future son-in-law had done or had chosen not to know. Both possibilities were bad. Kenji hadn't moved from his position near the door. He said something low to Taro, who translated it as, "Commander Kenji wishes to make clear that none of this is your concern. You took something that doesn't belong to you. The terms are simple." Caleb looked at Izumi. She set down the last piece of cornbread and, for the first time since Kenji walked through the door, looked up. Not at Kenji, at Caleb. Her expression had shifted. Still controlled, still unreadable around the edges, but not entirely closed. Something in it waited. He was a pawn in something centuries old, and she had just handed him the most dangerous piece on the board. Kenji delivered his terms the way a man reads a sentence that's already been written. No heat in it, no negotiation built into the phrasing. Taro translated it piece by piece, his voice careful and even. Izumi would be returned to her father's retainers by sundown. She would bring the trunk. She would come willingly, or she would come anyway, but she would come. The ranch would be vacated by Kenji's men. No damage done, no further action taken. That was the offer. There was no second offer. If sundown passed and she was still inside, the house of Lord Matsuda would formally designate this property a hostile structure. Taro said those last 2 words, hostile structure, in a way that made it clear they carried legal weight under a framework Caleb had no access to, but that the consequence was straightforward enough. The ranch would burn, the cattle would be taken, and Caleb would be left with 40 acres of ash and a land deed he couldn't pay anyway. Caleb let the silence settle after Taro finished. Then he asked the only question that seemed worth asking. "Does she want to go?" Kenji's face didn't change. He looked at Caleb for a long moment, the way a man looks at a map that's showing him something he doesn't trust. He didn't answer. Taro looked at the floor. His hands, Caleb noticed, were very still at his sides, the studied stillness of someone making a conscious effort not to fidget. Then Izumi spoke. 2 words. English, not Japanese, which meant she'd chosen the language deliberately so there was no translation step between her meaning and Caleb's ears. Not yet. She didn't look at Kenji when she said it. She looked at the table, but the 2 words sat in the room like a third person had walked in. Kenji's jaw tightened. One small motion, quickly controlled. He said something short to Taro, and Taro said, "Commander Kenji says this is not a decision that belongs to her." Caleb stood up from the table. He was aware of several things at once. The weight of the rifle on the wall, which he wasn't going to reach for because reaching for it would end everything in the wrong direction. The 300 men up on that ridge, who were presumably still there and presumably still watching the door of this ranch house. The 6 weeks left on his land deed, which had just become the least of his problems, and the fact that he was standing in a room with 2 people who were each, in different ways, using him as a fixed point in an argument he didn't fully understand. He could hand her over and be alive at sundown with a ranch still standing and a conscience he'd have to find some way to live in. Or he could buy time. "My land is neutral ground," he said. "That's frontier law. A man's property is a place of hospitality, and hospitality isn't a word I use lightly." He looked at Taro. "I need you to translate that exactly." Taro did. He translated it carefully, and something in his phrasing made 2 or 3 of the words land with slightly more weight than Caleb had given them. Caleb noticed that and filed it. Kenji listened. He was quiet for a moment after Taro finished. Then he spoke, longer this time, and Taro turned to Caleb and said, "He asks what you are proposing." 24 hours, Caleb said. "She stays. Nobody moves on this property. After that, whatever happens next, I won't stand in the way of it." He wasn't sure the last part was true, but he said it like it was. Kenji studied him with that same weight-bearing assessment he'd used at the fence. Then he gave a single word, and Taro said, "Agreed." But Kenji wasn't finished. He turned and said something toward the door, a short command, and outside Caleb heard horses moving. Taro translated quietly. 50 men will remain at the fence line through the night. Caleb nodded once. He'd expected something like that. Evening came fast. By the time the last light went out of the sky, the ranch was a small, warm square surrounded by darkness and 50 men who weren't sleeping. Inside, Izumi started talking. She spoke English the way someone speaks a language they learned in private. Competent, deliberate, with a slight formality in the word choices that comes from learning by reading before learning by talking. She'd picked it up from a Dutch merchant in Nagasaki who traded in printed goods and spoke 4 languages badly and 1 of them well. English happened to be the good one. She'd let Caleb believe she didn't understand it. He didn't seem offended when she admitted that. He just poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and waited. She told him about her brother first. His name was Rin. He was 6 years older than her, the kind of older brother who taught you things your father thought were unsuitable for a daughter to know. How to read a land charter, how to spot a falsified seal, how to tell when a man in a formal room is lying by watching his hands instead of his face. Rin had been the intended heir, trained for it, built for it, and he'd been good at it in ways that made certain people around their father very uncomfortable. The man their father had chosen for the marriage was named Daisuke Ono. He ran a competing branch of the clan with a patience and pleasantness that Rin had never trusted. When Rin started pulling at loose threads in the clan's financial accounts and found a pattern that pointed toward Ono, the loose threads stopped being loose. Rin died of a sudden illness 3 months later. It was fast, and it was convenient, and everyone at the funeral said so quietly to each other and then went home. But before he got sick, Before, Izumi said, with a sharpness in the word that cut through the careful phrasing around it, Rin had written everything down. Every piece of evidence he'd found, every conversation he'd had, every instruction he could trace back to Ono. He'd given it to Izumi because she was the only person in the household whose loyalty he was certain of, and whose access to the document room nobody would question. She was, after all, just a daughter. The document in the trunk wasn't a land charter. It was a full account of how her brother died, signed by Rin while he still could hold a brush, and it named Ono in every relevant detail. She looked at Caleb across the table. "I needed a witness," she said. "Not a Japanese witness, not someone inside the clan system, not someone who owes my father anything, not someone Ono's money has already touched." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, not drinking it, just holding the warmth. "Someone outside. Someone who has no stake in what happens next." Caleb said, "So you ran 3,000 miles to find a stranger?" "I ran until I found the right kind of stranger." She paused. "You fed me. You asked nothing. You didn't take the trunk while I slept, even though you could have. That is rare." He sat with that a moment. The fire had burned down to coals that pulsed orange and red in the draft coming under the door. Outside, he could hear the horses at the fence line shifting their weight, the creak of leather and the low sound of men trying not to be cold. He understood now what she was actually asking him. She wasn't asking him to fight Kenji or defy her father or get himself killed over a document written in a language he couldn't read. She was asking him to stand in a room and say he saw it, to put his name next to hers as someone who existed outside the system that wanted this buried. He could hand her over at dawn, walk away with his roof and his 3 cows and his land deed and the knowledge that he'd done the sensible thing. He looked at the trunk, then at her. He didn't sleep that night, but by 3 a.m, the decision was already made. He just didn't know yet that Izumi hadn't waited for him to make it. She hadn't waited for him to decide. That was the thing. While Caleb was still awake at 3 a.m, turning the question over like a stone he kept expecting to find something different under, Izumi had already moved. She hadn't made noise about it. She'd slipped a folded piece of paper through a gap in the fence boards, not toward the main line of men, not toward Kenji's position on the north side, but toward a specific spot on the east fence where a particular horse had been standing since dark. She'd aimed the message at Taro. Caleb found out about this at first light when Taro appeared at the door alone. No Kenji, no escort. Just Taro, with his notebook under his arm and that careful stillness he wore like a second coat, and a look on his face like a man who has just been reminded of something he'd spent months trying not to think about. Caleb let him in. Izumi was already sitting at the table. What came out over the next 20 minutes rearranged everything Caleb thought he understood about the situation. Taro had not come to Arizona out of loyalty to Kenji. He'd come because refusing would have meant something worse happening to people he cared about, and because being inside the search party was the only way to slow it down without stopping it entirely. For 3 weeks he'd been threading a needle, giving Kenji enough information to keep the search credible, while buying Izumi enough time to find what she needed. It was exhausting work that had no clean ending, and when her note came through the fence boards, he'd recognized her handwriting in the dark by the particular pressure of her brushstroke, because Ren had once showed him how she wrote her own name. Taro and Ren had grown up in the same household, not brothers, but close enough that the word was easier than the accurate one. When Ren died, Taro had wrapped the grief in silence and kept walking, because that was the only direction available. He'd told no one. He'd done what he was told. Until last night, when a piece of paper came through a fence in the Arizona desert and reminded him that Ren's sister was still alive and still fighting and still needed him to be something other than useful. The plan was straightforward and dangerous in exactly the proportion those two things usually combine. Izumi needed the document witnessed. 3 witnesses, Caleb and 2 men from the camp who had served directly under Ren and whose names on the paper would carry weight under clan law. Taro knew which men. He could get them to the fence at sunrise without Kenji seeing it as anything more than a rotation of the watch. The witnessing had to happen in the open, in front of the full camp, because a document signed in secret could be challenged. It had to be public to be binding, which meant Caleb needed to walk out to the fence at sunrise, in full view of 300 men, and formally receive 2 strangers onto his property. Caleb looked at Izumi. "Kenji will figure out what's happening." She met his eyes. "Yes." "And when he does?" She said nothing for a moment. Then, "He will have to decide who he is." That was not an answer, but it was honest, which he'd started to understand was the way she operated. She didn't pretend the ground was solid when it wasn't, but she walked on it anyway. Outside, the sky was turning gray along the eastern ridge. The horses at the fence line were stirring. Taro set his notebook on the table, opened it to a blank page, and put a pen beside it. Caleb picked up the pen, looked at it, set it back down. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and opened the door. The sunrise came up hard and orange over the eastern ridge, and Caleb walked out into it with no rifle and no plan beyond the one Izumi had already made for him. The 2 men Taro had pulled from the watch rotation were already at the fence. They were older than Caleb expected, 50s, weathered, the kind of faces that have seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. They stood straight anyway. They held their hats in their hands when they stepped through the gate, a small gesture that told him everything about what this moment meant to them. He didn't know their names. Taro told him later, but in that moment, they were just 2 men who had decided that a dead man's account mattered more than a living lord's command, and that was enough. The document came out of the trunk. Izumi unrolled it on the fence post, held the edges flat against the morning wind, and Caleb put his name on it with Taro's pen. The 2 men from camp signed below him with their own brushes, quick and deliberate. Taro witnessed it. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. Kenji saw it on the 2nd minute. He came down from the north position at a canter. No preamble, no formal approach, and the shift in his movement rippled back through the camp the way a stone ripples water. Every man up on that ridge who had been still suddenly wasn't. The sound of 300 horses adjusting their weight at once is not loud exactly, but it carries. Caleb heard it without looking up from the fence post. He heard Kenji's voice, sharp and short, and didn't need Taro to translate the meaning. He heard the order in it. Taro stepped between Kenji and the fence. Just stepped there. No dramatic gesture, no hand on a weapon he wasn't carrying. He just put his body in the space and stood in it. And the world balanced on that for a moment the way a cup balances on a tilted surface, right at the edge of the point of no return. The camp fractured. It didn't happen loudly. Maybe 160 men held their ground where they were. The rest looked at Kenji and then at Taro, and then made a choice that would cost them everything they'd built their lives around, and they made it anyway. You could see it move through them. Not a wave exactly, more like a door closing in sections, 1 man at a time going still in a different way than before. Kenji and Caleb stood at the fence, with no translator between them for the first time. Just 2 men, looking at each other across a fence post, with a document sitting on top of it, neither of them reaching for anything. Caleb didn't step back, didn't reach for the rifle that wasn't there. He just stood and let Kenji read his face. And whatever Kenji found there, it wasn't what he'd come down the hill expecting. Kenji drew his sword. The camp went completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The specific absence of sound that happens when hundreds of people stop breathing at the same moment. He held it. Flat, not raised. Point down toward the earth, grip tight, knuckles pale against the leather wrap. His eyes didn't move from Caleb's. Then Izumi walked out of the ranch house. She carried the trunk in both arms, and she opened it right there in the dirt, and she took out the tanto. the blade her grandfather had carried at Sekigahara, and she held it flat across both palms and extended it toward Kenji without a word. Every man in that camp understood what she'd just done. Caleb didn't, but he watched Kenji's face, and he saw the sword arm lower. Kenji sheathed his sword. He didn't say anything after that. He turned his horse, rode back up the slope, and the men who were still following his order went with him, roughly 140 riders pulling away from the ridge in a slow column, heading northwest toward the coast. No final warning, no formal declaration, just the sound of hooves going quiet in the distance, and then the dust hanging in the air where they'd been. The 160 who stayed didn't move toward the ranch. They just sat where they were, on the dry, flat ground outside the fence line, horses still, weapons down, waiting. For what, Caleb couldn't tell. He looked at Taro. Taro looked out at the men and said quietly, "They have no lord now." Caleb waited for him to say more. He didn't. So Caleb asked Izumi. She was standing beside him, the empty trunk open in the dirt at her feet, the tanto back inside it. She watched Kenji's column disappear around the edge of the northern ridge, and her face held the particular stillness of someone who has just done a thing they prepared for and still didn't fully believe they could do. She said, "When a retainer defies a direct order from his lord, he loses everything. His rank, his income, his house, his name inside the clan." She paused. "Those men chose my brother's justice over my father's command. They knew what it would cost before they held their ground." Caleb looked out at 160 men sitting in the Arizona dust with nowhere to be. No lord, no clan, no home to ride back to. Ronin. He'd heard the word from Taro, and now he understood the weight sitting inside it. Warriors without a master, which sounds like freedom until you understand that the entire structure of the life they'd built was built around belonging to something, and they'd just cut themselves loose from it on a Tuesday morning in a foreign desert over a document they'd never read. He stood there for a long moment. Then he asked, "Can any of them work cattle?" Taro turned to look at him. Caleb kept his eyes on the camp. "I've got 40 acres, 3 cows, and a fence that needs rebuilding from that storm. I'm not in a position to offer much, but the land's got room, and I've got a well that doesn't run dry." Taro stared at him a second longer, then turned toward the camp and called out the question in Japanese. His voice carried flat across the open ground. The silence that followed was long enough that Caleb started to think he'd miscalculated something. Then, somewhere in the middle of the camp, a sound started. Not a cheer, not anything formal, just laughter, the sudden helpless kind that breaks out of men when the tension they've been holding for days finds a release valve they weren't expecting. It moved through the camp in a wave, one man catching it from the next, and within 30 seconds, it was everywhere. Taro turned back to Caleb with something close to a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Most of them say yes." The document was rolled tight and sealed into the trunk with the tanto. It would travel east within the week, bound for the American consulate in Tucson. From there, the path was slow and complicated and not guaranteed, but it was moving, which was more than it had been 3 days ago. 3 weeks later, the ranch looked like a different property. The east fence was rebuilt with cedar posts set deep and straight, the kind of work that takes more hands than Caleb had ever had. The roof was patched and sealed. The cattle herd had doubled because the Ronin brought horses, and 2 of them turned out to know exactly what to do with a lasso once Taro explained the concept through 3 increasingly chaotic demonstrations. Izumi had taken over the barn in the mornings. She'd set up a small campo practice. Herbs she'd carried compressed into the lining of the trunk. Treatments she'd learned from a physician in Osaka who believed daughters deserved the same education as sons. Redwood Flats, which had spent the first week watching the camp outside town with rifles propped against window frames, now had a line forming at the barn door before sunrise. A man's back doesn't ask where the remedy came from. Taro fell off the same horse 4 times on a Thursday afternoon. The 5th time he stayed on, the entire camp made a sound that startled the cattle. The trunk sat in Caleb's strongbox, locked. The most consequential object in the Arizona Territory, and not a soul in Redwood Flats knew it existed. The land deed got paid, not with cattle money, with rent charged fair to 160 men who needed somewhere to be. Izumi's father would receive the document. What he did with it was another story. Ono was still powerful. The fight wasn't close to finished. At dusk, Caleb found Izumi at the fence, looking west toward the direction Kenji had ridden. She said she'd leave when word came back that the document had been received. He didn't ask when that would be. The trunk was still in the strongbox. The men were still camped outside. One bowl of rice started all of this, and it isn't over yet. If you want to find out what happens next, subscribe. This story keeps going.